We're going to get started. I know you're still eating, and you should feel free to do that, but Harold is going to be addressing a very important topic, and we don't want to cut into his time. So he agreed. He said, let's get started. So he doesn't mind the clatter. Harold Hongju Koh is one of our leading authorities on public and private international law and human rights. He's the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School, where he's been teaching since 1985 and where he served as the 15th dean from 2004 to 2009. He was elected to the ALI in May of 1992 and was elected to the council in May of 2013. From 2009 to 2013, Harold joined the State Department as a legal advisor, service for which he received the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award. He returned to that office in 2021 as senior advisor under President Joe Biden. He's had other government service, significant. He clerked for Judge Malcolm Wilkie on the D.C. Circuit and for Justice Harry A. Blackmun on the U.S. Supreme Court. I came to know Harold during his Supreme Court clerkship, and we've been great friends ever since then. He's a remarkable scholar, a tremendous public servant, and a wonderful person. And it's a great honor to introduce him today. Harold.
Thank you, David. It's really an honor to be here. I especially am delighted to see so many friends here, and to thank David Levi, who's been my brother in the law from the West Coast side of the family for 42 years. And I also wanted to single out Judge Diane Wood, who's been my friend for almost as long as David Levi. And what a extraordinary piece of luck to have the two of them in these positions. As David mentioned, I speak today wearing three hats. I've been a law professor of international law for now 43 years. I served in 4 presidential administrations doing issues of international law. And since 2016, I've been one of the lawyers for Ukraine in 3 different cases, one of which we're going to argue in a couple weeks in The Hague. And in that last capacity, I've often been asked what we call the Tina Turner question, namely, what's law got to do with it? And it's surprising that often the people who ask me this question are lawyers themselves. And so today I want to, if you want to remember these remarks by 6 words. First, the stakes. Second, law's role. And third, the future. The stakes, why lawyers should care. Law's role, what lawyers have contributed to where we are in this continuing crisis. And third, the future, how lawyers can help us to get to where we'd like to be. So the history is something familiar to all of you. Ukraine became independent in 1991 with the breakup of the USSR, and under a series of governments tried to move closer to the European Union. And when their leader, strongly influenced by the Kremlin, tried to keep them within the Russian orbit, this led to a mass demonstration in the Maidan, Independence Square, in 2013, where activists from Ukraine courageously declared their desire to be an independent country and part of Europe as opposed part of the Russian orbit. They were, for their participation, some were shot by snipers, there were battles, and in response, a pro-European leader was elected. But in response to that, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And although the US and Europe imposed sanctions, they staged a phony referendum whereby Crimea supposedly seceded from Ukraine and joined Russia. And meanwhile, in 2014, in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics or provinces, so-called little green men, who were Russian-influenced soldiers not wearing uniforms, began to engage in paramilitary activities to break this part of Ukraine off from the main country. That group has now been succeeded by a group of deadly mercenaries known as the Wagner Group, who have been leading the fight in Bakhmut. And Ukraine fought back with its allies. The relevance of this being that if you have been surprised by Ukraine's success on the battlefield since 2022, it is because they have been fighting against Russia for the last 10 years almost. And Russia's history with Ukraine has been characterized by three elements: brutality, colonialism, and the so-called big lie. A popular trope in Russia is that they are fighting Nazis, and therefore Ukraine is like the Nazis. And so this referendum poster from March 2014 says, on March 16th, we choose between the Nazis and Russia, ignoring the fact that the combination of Nazi killings and Stalinist killings led to the death of nearly 21 million innocent Ukrainians between 1933 and 1945. Really the largest slaughter of civilians anywhere in the world, thus leading to the title or label of the Bloodlands. This leads us to what we all know. February of 2022, when not one, not two, but three Russian wars began against Ukraine. The first was what we know well, the Kinetic War, which began with a massive shock and awe campaign where Putin settled in for a war of aggression, atrocity, and attrition that was initially countrywide, but then because of the success of the Ukrainian resistance, fell back to focus on Crimea, the eastern provinces, and the key ports. As President Biden put it in the speech in Warsaw, Putin bombed train stations, maternity hospitals, schools, and orphanages. He combined indiscriminate shelling from afar with close-up brutality and this illegal diplomatic strategy of annexation, which was rejected by the United Nations General Assembly by 143 votes. But in this first war, the Kinetic War, Putin underestimated the resolve of the Ukrainians. He also underestimated the Western capacity for unity and sanctions, and he underestimated the peril of relying on conscripts from his own country who were not deeply committed to this war effort. So this has led us to this unusual situation, which we have been facing a war between the two largest countries in Europe, Ukraine, which has 44 million people, and Russia, which has some 141 million people. And at the moment, they're in somewhat of a state of stalemate. How is this possible? Very simply, because of the combination of sanctions being imposed on Russia and high-tech military aid from the United States flowing to the Ukrainians. What's essentially happened is that we have a 20th century Goliath, Putin's clumsy, massively armed, conventional army of conscripts using outmoded weapons, fighting against a agile, flexible, and high-tech group of experienced soldiers from Ukraine who are getting weapons that are flowing from Western allies. And so the Ukrainians are replenishing with modern weapons. The Russians cannot. And this has led to a situation where relatively small bands of Ukrainian forces have been able to force the Russians to expend extraordinary resources, even for battles of a place like Bakhmut. As one of my colleagues said, and I say this for my friend Linda Silverman, who understands basketball terminology, what's going on is like a full court press in basketball, because the Ukrainians have been forcing the Russians to be on the defensive all across their line of attack. The Russians are not able to play the game or wage the war they want. And this counter strategy is putting time on Ukraine's side if it can survive. Because as we all know, full court presses hurt not just the team that's being subjected to the full court press, but also the team that's pressing. And that's exactly what we're seeing now with the recent fall of Bakhmut after months of fighting and the loss of some 100,000 Russian troops, which is more than the population of Bakhmut, only 75,000. A remarkable fact is this could be a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians, which sets the stage for a massive Ukrainian counteroffensive in the spring, or it could be the moment where the Ukrainian forces start to ebb. This turns on the strength and courage of the Ukrainian forces. The second war was the cyber war, which began the day before the kinetic invasion. Russia launched a hybrid offensive attack by cyberspace on 48 Ukrainian entities. Their main weapon was using wiper malware of the kind that they had previously used successfully in the NotPetya virus. And they positioned this alongside a disinformation campaign directed at 4 audiences. They told the Russians, we are winning. They told Ukraine, you will lose. They told the US and Europe, don't get involved. And they told non-aligned states, stay out of it and come in on Russia's side. This disinformation campaign was extremely unsuccessful. And it has only worked with one audience, which is Russian audiences the age of most of the people in this room. Why? Because like us, those people watch TV. They watch 60 Minutes or the equivalent, where they're being told by Russian propaganda, we're winning. But younger people using social media are seeing the reality and the tweeting by their colleagues who are fleeing the country. In Moscow, there are no military-age males. If you are there, you will be drafted and sent to the front. People are extremely discontent because their children are being conscripted and sent to fight a war they don't want to fight with inadequate weapons. And so the parents are themselves going out and try to buy body armor and other kinds of equipment to save their children. Meanwhile, Ukraine, working closely with Western information service providers like Microsoft, launched a 4-part defense: detect, defend, disrupt, deter, where they spread their digital operations across servers throughout Europe in the cloud, which made it impossible for Russia to take down their servers. Private cell phone companies gave unlimited roaming to Ukrainian individuals, which allowed them to maintain cyber contact all during the immediate aftermath of the attacks. Private allies used artificial intelligence to detect breaches and install corrective patches as endpoint protections. And so the net result was the cyber attacks by the Russians and their expert hackers, many of whom had, including attacking the US electoral system in 2016, largely failed. So This means that the first round of attacks by Russia on the ground were stalemated. The second round was blocked by cyber ingenuity. And this includes, for example, Elon Musk giving access to the Starlink satellite, which meant that Ukraine was able to run its government from a series of locations within subway stations. And in this, Putin had radically misunderstood and underestimated a young man named Volodymyr Zelensky, who was a comedian. You can actually see his show on Netflix, Servant of the People. Nobody realized that he is actually Churchill with a cell phone. And that through Zoom and modern connectivity, he has been able to keep up a global campaign to build alliances of a kind that we have not seen in our lifetime. So what was the third war? And what was law's role? It was a legal war. Some have dismissively used the term lawfare, but it was a full court press strategy pioneered by the Ukrainian government itself. They got lawyers together in various forums, and they decided that we would file 2 cases before the International Court of Justice, 2 under the law of the Sea Treaty, 5 before the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, provoke an investigation by the International Criminal Court, bring a World Trade Organization case about trade in transit, and a series of international commercial arbitration cases on behalf of expropriated Ukrainian entities about assets in Crimea that has led most recently to a $5 billion arbitration ruling on behalf of Naftogaz against Russia, won by Covington and Burling and others. So, what were the stakes? This is a colonial war. This is a battle between the past of Russia and the future of Europe. Putin is an imperialist who seeks to rewrite history. He will not let what is going on in Ukraine be called a war. It's called a special military operation. He does not allow it to be recalled that Stalin was originally Hitler's ally in World War II. He denies the reality of the Ukrainian state, which he sees as an object of history. And he claims that Russia's broken world can only be restored by annihilating Ukraine with violence. So this sets the stakes for how this has been framed by the two sides. Russia wants to regain lost empire. Ukraine has lived through 2 failed empires and doesn't want to return. Russia wants to do it through hard power. Ukraine fights back with smart power, democracy, international law, and alliances. Russia's tool is aggression and atrocity. Ukraine's law and diplomacy. Russia treats this as a localized struggle. Ukraine has turned this into a global struggle. Russia's short game is force. Ukraine's long game is law. And Russia says this is about the past, our regaining and retaining empire, where Ukraine says this is about the present and the future. Russia against the world order. So what does that mean for international law? In my lifetime, professional lifetime, there have been 3 huge events in international law. One was the Cuban expropriation of the 60s. Another was the Iranian hostage crisis of the 80s. And this is the third. Each of these occupied the time and energy of thousands of lawyers for the next 3, 4, 5 decades. So make no mistake, the issues raised by the Russia-Ukraine struggle will go to the rest of the lifetime of most of us in this room. The international law issues cover the spectrum. You could teach an entire course on this. In fact, my friend Gene Fidel and I are also teaching such courses on such issues as state succession, law of the sea, the law of aggression or going to war, the law of opposing aggression through mutual defense treaties and countermeasures, and the law in wartime, humanitarian law, the tactics of child stealing, filtration camps, use of illegal weapons like hypersonics and thermobarics, environmental injury at Zaporizhia, which could become the next Chernobyl, kinetic use of AI. We talked about AI. AI is being used by both sides in this war with devastating effect. The use of mercenaries and cyber mercenaries like the Wagner Group, which is filled with individuals who are functioning essentially autonomously from Putin, and the law of cyber warfare. So in the middle of this discussion, what should lawyers do? And essentially, they should work with Ukraine's grand strategy, which is very simple and formulated early and coherently. Putin's short game is force, Ukraine's long game is law. This means 5 things. 1, get as much information out there as possible because open sources show Russia's illegality. 2nd, isolation. Make Putin an isolated outlaw in an interdependent world. Sanction him, sanction his subordinates, sanction his cronies, take their yachts, take their football teams. Make him a pariah. 3rd, illegality. Brand all of their actions illegal. 4th, in this weakened position, hope to drive him into diplomacy. With luck, it's something that looks like an accelerated Dayton peace process. Dayton took years to achieve through the extraordinary work of the late Richard Holbrooke. And then finally, in all of this, to preserve accountability, where issues of criminal and civil accountability under domestic and international law are not taken off the table, but are kept in the game, what I like to call a fragmented Nuremberg. So this is the goal, and lawyers are playing all of these roles. Take, for example, information. In a time of open source, we can now create focal points for evidence gathering, which include not just government sources and UN sources, but new NGOs like Truth Hounds, new important websites like Bellingcat, and digital crowdsourcing, among them Yale School of Public Health Humanitarian Research Lab. This is a picture that they took from satellite of a filtration camp in Ukraine. On illegality and isolation, I work with a group of lawyers, Marnie Cheek, Jonathan Gimblett, and David Zients of Covington and Burling. We brought in also a French co-counsel, Professor Jean-Marc Tuvenen of the University of Nanterre, working with Oksana Zolotaryova, who is the international law head of the foreign ministry, to try to figure out ways to further Putin's isolation by promoting his illegality. And so it also turned out that the strongest advocate of Ukraine in the Obama administration had been Vice President Biden. And before he left office, he signed off on, approved, bringing a law of the sea case against Russia in the Permanent Court of Arbitration about theft of all of Ukrainians' resources on the water, and another case charging them with violations of the Terrorism Financing Convention and racial discrimination in Crimea, which is about their theft of human rights on land. This just gives you a flavor of the comprehensive violation of Ukrainians' law of the sea rights. In the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, Russia has stolen oil and gas, obstructed navigation, stolen fisheries, stolen cultural heritage, and polluted the marine environment. And this is a memorable picture of Putin, like a modern-day James Cameron, arriving in his bathyscaphe, having just seized an important piece of Ukrainian cultural heritage from an archaeological dig. Now, as we were working on this case at the end of 2021, our co-counsel said to us, what do we do, our Ukrainian co-counsel, what do we do if Putin invades? And we said, you should file another case. And they said, would you prepare one? And they said, we hope this doesn't happen. And then, as you know, in February 2022, Putin invaded. And again, invoking the big lie, he said he was invading because Ukraine was committing genocide against its own people. So once again, the big lie, the factual lie, Ukraine is committing genocide against its own people. Zelensky is the first Jewish president. I'm not sure that he's a Nazi. And a legal dispute, that somehow this gives Russia legal authority to invade Ukraine to stop this so-called genocide from occurring. Now, it turns out this creates a dispute about the interpretation, application, and fulfillment of the Genocide Convention. So on Putin's lies, we founded jurisdiction. We then got a call. Last year, I was on sabbatical in England, in which our client said, we are in the Carpathian Mountains. Our homes are destroyed. We've driven 26 hours. What do we do now? And we said, why don't you file the suit? And they looked at it and they said, we're ready, file it. And could you also write a tweet on behalf of President Putin saying you're filing? And so 2 days after the invasion, we filed. And here I, with my daughter, we went back to The Hague, where things were full of this kind of sign, appeared in court less than a month after the original invasion. Here we all are, it's a COVID courtroom, we're all wearing masks. You see that Russia did not appear. Its lawyers all quit, but many of the judges were there on Zoom. We heard discussion about the Zoom courtroom today. And in my closing, I thought we had to specify the stakes, which is a court of law must act because the tragedy we're witnessing in the streets of Kyiv is exactly what the international legal system was designed to prevent. If this court doesn't act decisively against this level of aggression and atrocity, why should any permanent UN member ever see international law as an obstacle to its national interest? Then why wouldn't we be forced to conclude and concede that the post-war international legal project has failed? It was a challenge to the court, and some were nervous about making this challenge. But we had to ask them, why are you a judge if you're going to do nothing in this circumstance? They took the challenge. Just 9 days later, in a ruling that exceeded our own expectations, 13-2, they said that Russia must immediately suspend all military operations in the territory of Ukraine, and unanimously held that they may not aggravate the dispute. At which point I got a call from a journalist here in Washington who said, I think this is a paper ruling, because after all, the World Court can't enforce its own judgments. And I said, excuse me, no court anywhere in the world can enforce its own judgments, including the United States Supreme Court. But you may have heard that it is a province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. And if it is declared illegal, then everyone can enforce the order to stop the aggression, sanction the perpetrators, and bring them to justice. And this is what brands or give lawyers their role, to take further efforts based on this to brand Putin an outlaw. There is no argument about jurisdiction once he's violating essentially a preliminary injunction of the court. It promotes more information sharing. It isolates him further. It strengthens the case for further sanctions and accountability and diplomacy, and it links Ukraine's legal strategy with its grand strategy, with Biden's strategy, with the EU's strategy. And that is what we have been trying to do, to make the legal piece of this an important factor in the resolution. So what happens now, and I know we're running short of time, there will be an end game, we hope. The mud is drying out. The counteroffensive will begin. We'll see where we are in the fall. And then the question is, will someone, quote, sue for peace in which case we would have a structure of diplomacy backed by law. One obvious candidate to mediate, the UN Secretary General, who has on multiple occasions negotiated the grain deal. The Pope has offered to be a mediator, at least with regard to stolen children. On process issues, we need to decide the structure of the deal, the terms of the ceasefire, the negotiated borders, terms of neutrality. And by the way, another feature of the illegal ruling, the ruling that's illegal, has been to keep China and India on the sideline because they don't want to be accused of aiding and abetting a gross violation of international law, and finding appropriate guarantors and enforcement. Zelensky himself has stated in terms of 4 main issues: peace, security, POWs, and accountability. And this is the piece that is perhaps the most important and challenging for all of you for the long term. $58 billion estimated of frozen Russian assets. 3 different forums: the International Court of Justice, where we have our 2 cases. The merits hearing in their terrorism and CERD case will be June 6th to 14th, where we'll make our showing on the merits. Meanwhile, a civil reparations and compensation process is being worked out and proposed, and a registry of damages created under UN General Assembly resolution. And then criminal accountability, domestic, an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, and discussion of the creation of a special aggression tribunal. Its precise form, international or hybrid, still being debated. But look how much freedom Putin has already lost. He cannot travel. He cannot move his money. His children cannot travel. He is a prisoner in his own country. He could be deposed. He could be assassinated. He could flee to a dacha somewhere in the Middle East with some money and be replaced by another KGB person like Yuri Andropov. We don't know. The question is, what will happen come this fall? So I think, as President Clinton put it at my old boss, Madeleine Albright's funeral, Madeleine got it right. I'll try to use the voice. He said, she thought the Ukrainians could prevail. If we just stick with them. Or as President Biden put it, Putin doubted our staying power and whether NATO could remain unified. He thought he was going to see the Finlandization of NATO, but instead he saw the NATOization of Finland. And this is really about the power of democracies to deliver for our people. In the middle of it all, and this is where I close, we can't forget the human costs. Our agent, Deputy Minister Yanin, was about 2 months ago tragically killed in a helicopter crash. And just before the pandemic, I went to Kyiv, where I was greeted by this young woman on the bottom left, Tata Maharian, who was the International Law Moot Court champion of Ukraine. And shortly after the invasion, I turned on CNN, and there she was on the right in military uniform. She had enlisted. And she said, "Where is the law I believed in?" She said, "I don't know how long I can go with my close friends being captured, being wounded, and dying. It's very, very devastating." That same week, I judged Yale students in the International Law Moot Court. And then a couple days later, I judged Ukrainian students in the exact same moot court. Same issues, same arguments, same, in fact, comparable skill level. But what was most striking was that it was the 25th anniversary of the International Law Moot Court in Ukraine. And all the past champions came back. And here they are holding signs for when they won 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And as I went down the line congratulating them, I said, "What are you doing now?" And they said, "I'm suing Russia." Where? "I'm suing Russia on the Naftagas case. I'm suing Russia in the law of the sea. I'm suing Russia in the European Convention of Human Rights." And Tata tweeted this out on put it out on Instagram. Dear Mr. Koh, let us battle a little bit on the ground, and we'll be back to the Ukrainian International Law Army. In closing, let me cite my colleague at Yale, Tim Snyder, who says, a Ukrainian victory would confirm the principle of self-rule, allow the integration of Europe, empower people of goodwill to return to their other challenges, where a Russian victory, by contrast, would extend genocidal policies, subordinate Europe, starve Africa and Asia, strengthen fascist tyrants as well as nihilists. And so this is a war about the principles that will guide us in the 21st century, and whether there's a possibility for a democratic future under the rule of law. If this are the stakes, we lawyers can't be bystanders. The stakes are about the rule of law. Law helped us to get where we are, and we'll need legal help to get to where we want to be. Now, some say this is just about power. They're right. It's about Russian hard power against the power of an underdog, Ukraine, vastly enhanced by smart power. And that smart power is provided by the rule of law. And the question is, who will win? And on that, all of us have a part to play. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold, for that riveting talk and for your heroic efforts. We now have to scoot back to our room for government ethics. Here we are in our 100th anniversary, and to hear you speak about the long game. Law is our long game. It's our long game, too. So we truly understand what you're talking about. Thank you so much.